is The Chris Abraham Show.
Hey there, this is Chris Abraham, and this is The Chris Abraham Show, Season 8, Episode 4, and I am bringing ChatGPT in to be my podcast co-host. Hello, ChatGPT.
Hello, Chris. It's great to be your co-host on The Chris Abraham Show. What exciting topics are we diving into today?
Well, one of my fans on Facebook actually echoed something I said, like a quippy idea I wanted everybody to end up internalizing and being a repeater, if you will, a memetic repeater, a meme carrier. Can you define meme carrier based on the memetic jargon? And nobody's ever done it, but he did it. And he said to me, I was thinking about what you said about freedom. And the fact is that the Democrats have a concept of freedom, but it's a freedom from. Whereas MAGA and the Republicans have their own ethos about freedom, and it's freedom to. And I wanted to do an episode on that, to go deeper into these two theories that both believe that what they're doing is pursuing freedom.
That's a fascinating topic, Chris. In memetic jargon, a meme carrier is someone who spreads ideas, behaviors, or styles, essentially acting as a vehicle for transmitting memes. In this context, the idea of freedom from versus freedom to is a compelling meme. Freedom from typically means liberation from oppression, want, or fear, essentially protection against certain negative conditions. For Democrats, this could translate to policies ensuring freedom from poverty, discrimination, or lack of health care. On the other hand, freedom to emphasizes the ability to act without restraint, focusing on individual liberties. For MAGA and some Republicans, this might mean the freedom to own firearms, start a business with minimal regulation, or express oneself freely without censorship. Exploring these concepts can reveal a lot about the underlying values and priorities of each group. It's a nuanced discussion that delves into what freedom means in different political and ideological contexts. Where do you want to start unpacking this?
Well, when people are dismissive over this idea, which I think is beautifully succinct, and you, a large language model, completely get it, even without me giving you any context at all, like, why do people roll their eyes? Do they think that I'm being too reductionist? Are they maybe not clever enough to conceive of its broadness and I guess insight? Do you think that most people are just thinking about themselves and really, or they don't like things being over-reduced, or it makes their side look foolish, or makes the other side look, or it's a counter narrative to what they believe freedom to be, or that it's challenging it all? Or they just look me in the face, see that I'm dumb, and then assume what I said is dumb. What do you think?
I think you've touched on several key reasons why people might roll their eyes at such discussion. First, complexity aversion plays a role. Many people prefer simple, straightforward narratives, and the nuanced exploration of freedom's different conceptions can be overwhelming or feel overly abstract. Second, cognitive dissonance can cause discomfort. If someone's deeply held beliefs are challenged, they might dismiss the argument to avoid the mental discomfort of reconciling conflicting ideas. Third, the idea might be perceived as reductionist, oversimplifying complex political ideologies into binary categories. This can be off-putting to those who see their political identity as nuanced and multifaceted. Lastly, some might feel it's a counter-narrative that threatens their worldview or makes their side appear foolish, leading to a defensive reaction. In sum, reactions can vary widely, but often they're tied to how the message is delivered and the listener's.
Can you repeat that, please?
Sure. People might roll their eyes for a few reasons. First, complex ideas can feel overwhelming, and some prefer simpler narratives. Second, if the idea challenges their
One thing I think the one point you made is really true insofar that if freedom is completely defined differently by each side, and if each side believes that they know what freedom means, and the dissonance of the fact that there's a radio show that I love called No Agenda, and it has Adam Curry and John C. Dvorak, and I've spent over $1,000 supporting them. So I have the title of Sir Chris of Columbia Pike, or Sir Chris of the Pike. I'm a No Agenda Knight, so I'm really committed. For 17 years, I've been listening to them on streaming every Thursday and every Sunday, and they used to make this joke when Trump was elected in 2016 about there being a dimension A and a dimension B, and that people who supported Clinton or were never Trumpers lived in dimension B, and people who voted for Trump were in dimension A. And it was as if we were literally in dimensions, unable to see, hear, interact, or engage with any kind of conversation that would result in a useful outcome. And that the idea of freedom from and freedom to is also completely impossible, right? Like I roll my eyes when I hear the Harris campaign, who up till that point has been very anti-American, anti-traditionalism. They wanted to redo the Supreme Court, bring down the Electoral College, dismantle the Master's House, implement Parliament, or whatever. Socialism, democratic socialism, the concept of democracy went from being a process to a quasi-ideology, the idea of gender, the idea of sexuality, the idea of spectrum, the idea of feminism, the idea of abortion becoming a de facto secular, what is it called? A Catholic, what's the term begins with an S? Sacrament. And I think that the separation between A and B is irreconcilable, because while it's funny to say they're different dimensions, it's also really easy to say that their glossary of terms have completely and utterly different definitions.
You're touching on a profound point here. When two groups have fundamentally different interpretations of core concepts like freedom, it does create an almost dimensional divide. Each side operates with its own set of definitions, values, and priorities, leading to misunderstandings and dismissals. Your reference to Dimension A and Dimension B from No Agenda is a clever way to illustrate how these different realities exist side by side. It's not just that people disagree, it's that they're using entirely different frameworks to interpret the world around them. This can make meaningful dialogue challenging because each side feels like they're speaking a different language. Your point about the Harris campaign and the broader progressive movement embracing changes to traditional structures highlights how these differing glossaries of terms can fuel division.
Because the funny thing is that up until now, every single patriotic term has been by the left called a dog whistle. So when the right uses any kind of patriotism, people say things like the American flag is violence, or the Pledge of Allegiance is fascism, or all the things that have become God and country, the country song, I'm proud to be an American, or the Pledge of Allegiance, or the Star Spangled Banner, or whatever. And it feels really inauthentic when you get 4 years of reducing everything that's considered patriotic, proud American, any signifier of Americana, as being, if you will, a dog whistle for white supremacy, colonialism, and Christo-fascism. And then all of a sudden, within 100 days of the presidential election, to have Harris do a 180 and embrace all that iconography so as to try to cover the gulf. I think that really made people like, what is it that people say? People say that while the nanny state loves counting the number of lies that Trump tells during every single one of his rallies or speeches, most people realize that his lies are bullshitting. He's a bullshitter. He's a charming bullshitter and storyteller. Biden's a lot like that too. However, a lot of the lies that Harris and that campaign said were really big lies. And they were lies where there were lots of receipts. There were tons of clips showing that Harris, 100 days earlier, had completely other political beliefs. And I believe that people love a storyteller. People love a bullshit artist. People love bullshitty, like, storytelling, charming, wink, wink. Like, my mom was Irish, and I got to tell you, women love Irish scallywags. I mean, even moms love bragging about their children, their boys, I mean, who are little devils. Nobody loves any boy more than a mom loves a little devil. So there's a real appeal to a kind of devil-may-care defiance that is manifest in, Orange Man Bad. And it seemed like the kind of lies that the Democrats have been saying in the road to this election have been manipulative, right? Like this idea that they say in order for a CIA guy to appeal to someone he's trying to turn into an asset, he needs to do seductive things like mirroring, and by mirroring, what you do is you shapeshift into the person's dream meat. You create a cute meat, and you become who you need to be only for as long as you need to in order to convert the person. It's kind of a love bomb. It's kind of a cultish kind of strategy. And I think people, there's enough counter narrative, enough, if you will, what is it called? Deprogramming out there in terms of showing clips on YouTube about how someone behaved or talked about regular Americans, salt of the earth Americans, Gen Pop Americans, to make those big lies seem a lot worse than the thousands and thousands of playful, bullshitty lies.
You've highlighted a critical aspect of modern political discourse, the deep skepticism and cynicism towards politicians and their narratives. When there's a sudden shift in tone or messaging, especially from a political figure or party that previously held an opposing stance, it can come across as insincere or opportunistic. The portrayal of patriotic symbols as dog whistles for negative ideology has created a rift where displays of nationalism are viewed with suspicion by some. This skepticism makes sudden shifts in messaging, like Harris's embrace of patriotic imagery, appear strategic rather than genuine. Comparing the storytelling styles of different politicians, it's true that many people can forgive a certain level of embellishment if it feels like harmless bluster or entertainment. However, when perceived as manipulative or hypocritical, especially with evidence that contradicts previous statements, it can be damaging. This contrast between bullshitty storytelling and what some perceive as calculated deception plays a significant role in shaping public perception.
I mean, Trump has been a caricature of himself since the 70s, and he caricatures himself. He makes fun of himself on Saturday Night Live. He makes fun of himself in movies. He is the first to make fun of his hair, the first to make fun of his orange skin, the first to make fun of his long red tie. And as a result, since there's a continuity of him as a young man talking about the future of America during an interview about whether or not he'd ever want to be president to today. And there's still an understanding that he's just he's just a guy from Queens, even though he comes from developer money and he started off as a multimillionaire. There's still Jenny of the block, Trumpy of the Donnie of the block, and there's this idea that he's always been, if you will, that traditional multimillionaire New Yorker who is socially liberal and fiscally conservative. And I think he proves again and again and again that although he needs to kiss the ring of the Bible Belt and kiss the ring of the moral majority, he still is a New Yorker. He still has women in his cabinet who, unfortunately, as we know, Justice Thomas and Doctor, who's the African American who tried to become president who was a doctor?
You're thinking of Dr. Ben Carson.
Yeah, and Dr. Ben Carson, and then who's the woman who was working for the first Trump administration, whose husband's name is George and he's a Democrat?
That's Kellyanne Conway.
Yeah, Kellyanne Conway, Ben Carson, Justice Thomas. The funny thing is that if you are a groundbreaking MAGA or Republican or conservative and you're brown or black or a woman, you don't get the benefit of being breaking through any glass ceiling. You are just the black face of Christofascism, the brown face of Christofascism, and the female face of Christofascism. So no matter how many gay people, I feel like the first term had a major cabinet member who was openly gay, and he was the first of his kind, and apparently he was just a gay face of Christofascism. So no matter Trump never, or conservatives never get credit for any of the glass ceilings they break, because automatically if you are a conservative glass ceiling breaker, you are just reduced to being X variant version face of Christofascism. So I really think that people realize that Trump is a New Yorker. Trump has always had black, brown, Latino, gay, probably trans, women, all kinds of different friends and family and colleagues. I mean, people saw that happening all the time in his TV show, The Apprentice. And so people really know who he is, and that's why it seems like he is, not only Kevlar, not only iron, but he very much is nonstick Teflon Don, because people know who he is, and he hasn't flip-flopped, he hasn't shape-shifted, he hasn't changed, and people really don't know who Harris has ever been because she seems to be an empty pantsuit.
Your analysis points to a broader issue in political perception. Trump's long-standing public persona, cultivated over decades, has created an image of him as a consistent, if polarizing figure. His ability to laugh at himself and mean into his larger-than-life character has endeared him to supporters who appreciate his unorthodox approach. This consistency, whether perceived as authenticity or stubbornness, has made him a fixture in the political landscape. On the other hand, politicians like Kamala Harris face challenges when their public personas appear to shift with the political winds. If their identity or core beliefs seem less defined or are perceived as inconsistent, it can lead to skepticism about their motives or authenticity. The phenomenon you described, where breaking traditional barriers is dismissed if it comes from the wrong side of the political spectrum, reflects how deeply entrenched partisan identities have become. Achievements are often viewed through the lens of political affiliation, with accomplishments either celebrated or downplayed depending on whether they align with one's political team.
Alexa, I hate ChatGPT, continue.
I'm not quite sure how to help you with that.
Can you continue?
Absolutely. This dynamic contributes to the polarized environment where actions and achievements are often judged not on their own merits, but on the political identity of those behind them.
And whether you're in the right side of history, there's this whole concept that if you are an innovator, but you're on the wrong side of history, whatever that is, right? Like that can be shape shifty as well. What is the right side of history? Like the only thing I know that is on the right side of history that I think is in the rule books is that the 1960s Civil War, MLK MLK civil rights movement is the right side of history, and being against South African apartheid is the right side of history. But there's this narrative that you are either on the right side of history or the wrong side of history, which in many ways is a purity test. It is a threat and is reduced to that awful tyrannical thing called you're either for me or against me. You're either for us or against us, which is extremely existentially threatening.
Exactly. The notion of being on the right side of history has become a powerful rhetorical tool in political and social debates. It frames issues in stark terms, implying that one path aligns with progress and morality, while the other leads to obsolescence or wrongdoing. This dichotomy can indeed serve as a purity test, pressuring individuals and groups to conform to a particular narrative or risk being ostracized. This binary approach can stifle nuanced discussion and discourage critical thinking, as it discourages acknowledging the complexities and valid concerns of those with differing viewpoints. By labeling one side as the inevitable future and the other as a relic of the past, it simplifies complex issues into a moral struggle between good and evil. This framing can be particularly alienating for those who see themselves as innovators or reformers within a tradition, as their efforts are overshadowed by the broader narrative. It fosters an environment where allegiance to the right side of history is valued over the substance of one's contributions.
It's funny, right? Like, I know that you got stuck there, but hopefully you can hear me. I keep on telling people that the shrugging the chains off in terms of apartheid in South Africa is different because the oppressed were literally the 80% in South Africa who weren't Afrikaners or weren't white. In America, it's exactly the opposite. There's only 14 or 15% who are African American. So in this case, when you define the right side of history and so forth, you're literally trying 20% of America who are activists, liberal, organizers, progressives, socialists, communists, Maoists, revolutionaries, and activists, minorities are really only 25% of the American public. So that oppressed majority, people forget that oppressed majority, even though that 25% thinks they're the oppressed, they are, in many cases, MAGA considers itself that 80% repressed black majority from South Africa. So in many cases, the real populist uprising is by an oppressed Americans who just happen to be mostly white, but feel like they're being heavy-handed and controlled in ways that makes them feel like there's a type of apartheid between an elite, between the vanguard of a de facto proletariat, and the people who are just making ends meet.
That's an intriguing perspective, Chris. The comparison between the perceived dynamics in America and historical South African apartheid highlights how different groups can view themselves as oppressed, even when their circumstances are vastly different. The feeling of being marginalized or unheard can resonate across various demographics, leading to the rise of populist movements that challenge the established order. In the US, the narrative of being on the right side of history often comes from a place of seeking social justice and progress. However, for those who feel left behind or vilified by rapid social changes, this narrative can seem exclusionary or dismissive of their experiences. This is where the concept of an oppressed majority among certain groups, particularly within MAGA, gains traction. They perceive themselves as fighting against an elite minority that dictates cultural and political norms, much like the Afrikaners in South Africa. Despite the demographic differences, this sense of being under siege can fuel a populist response where traditional values and identities are championed as a counter.
I hate to blame the victims, but if the critical race theory, if the social justice warriors, quote unquote, if all those people didn't take to the streets, and if the anti-vaxxer vaccine COVID stuff didn't seem so completely oppressive against people's choice and their freedom, I think that I was watching Galactica 1980 and also Battlestar Galactica and Star Trek and so forth. And throughout the 70s, there were lots of like black actors in positions of power on TV and in movies were commonplace. I don't know where all the racism, all I mean, Friends, maybe it was the 90s because like Friends was all white and Seinfeld was all white. But in the 70s and the 80s, man, there were so many, like some of them were blaxploitation, but like there were black people in Star Trek, there were black people in Star Wars. I mean, frickin' Darth Vader is voiced by an African American man. I believe that either the man, quote unquote, the man has tried to foment this rise of a slumbering giant. You know how they make jokes about Russia and they say, do not poke the bear, do not poke the Russian bear is sleeping, do not poke them. I feel like in many ways, the only way to really poke America's moral majority, they call them the silent majority, is by turning the entire media into a world that either looks like 100% all the time, drag shows all the time, where the only people who watch the drag shows are babies, or where the silent majority thinks that there is some sort of demonic uprising manifest by the degeneracy of things like abortion and the degeneracy of things like gender non-binary, or the degeneracy of people just love who they love, like this pride. The obsession with pride, the obsession with LGBTQIA. I mean, it always boils down to me with regards to thinking about the concept of the frogs in the pan of water. And I really believe that the last 5 years, maybe the last 8 or 10 years, has been, I don't know, a leftist attempt at I don't know, revolution, or they're frustrated with the pace. And I also understand the existential crisis of people believing that in a rolling 12 years, the entire world is going to collapse because of climate change and global warming. But whatever it is, the impetus to try to modernize the country, modernize the beliefs, modernize the progressivism, make people more enlightened and secular, has turned the water to boil. And this moral majority this silent majority has jumped out of the pan, including Democrats, who previously were union members and workers. And I was just talking to my friend Kaushik, and even him, who is a technocrat, a technologist, an academic, a businessman, Even he prays to a Hindu monk, and this Hindu monk that he prays to gets him out of trouble. In the same way that I, even though I fancy myself a relatively enlightened man, I guess you might not say that because of these podcasts, but I like to fancy myself a man of science. I also, when in doubt, I pray to Mary. I pray to Mary, I do a Hail Mary, or I do an Our Father. And people forget that even like when it comes to the separation of church and state, a lot of people bring their secular to the office and even bring their secular to the friend group, but they bring their church to church and to their sanctum sanctorum, and like this private relationship they have with their deity of choice, even 12-step people, even if they just call them the architect of the architect of the universe, or whatever we Freemasons say, or any other people who believe in a higher power. People forget that that in many of us, we still really strongly believe that there is a spiritual world, and that there's a demonic world, and that there's a world. Most people in the entire world do not consider what is it called, magical realism, to be just a type of literature. They believe that the literature reflects the magical realism of reality.
You're touching on the deep interplay between public discourse, personal beliefs, and the role of spirituality in people's lives. The sense of a moral majority rising in response to perceived threats to traditional values reflects how many feel their way of life is under siege. This isn't just about political or cultural shifts. It's about a fundamental clash of worldviews. The portrayal of certain social movements and public health measures as oppressive or infringing on individual freedoms can trigger a defensive response from those who feel their autonomy is being undermined. This sentiment is exacerbated by the perception of rapid cultural changes, which can feel disorienting or even threatening to those with more traditional.
Yeah, and I think the mandate that 2024's election of Donald Trump, it says that the evolution forward of modern postmodern and postmodernism into a world where everybody has their own gender and their own pronoun. This is proof that that entire arc of goodness, arc of justice can totally be shut down, as well as the progress of climate change, the progress of Ukraine war, the progress of Palestine's in Gaza, the progress of trans therapy for young children. All of these things completely be shut down by the crushing fist of a silent majority, a bear that's woken up, and the fact that Trump won the Electoral College, he won the popular vote, he won the House and the Senate, and has the Supreme Court is a kick in the butt to show that this kind of social justice, the arc of justice, can be knocked down with a sharp stick.
The scenario you're describing paints a picture of a significant political shift where a resurgence of.
It's not a scenario. Check the internet. Trump won resoundingly on November 5th, was it?
I don't have access to. Donald J. Trump is the projected winner of the 2024 U.S. presidential election, according to multiple news sources. For the most up-to-date information about the U.S. election, please visit news sources like the Associated.
All right, well, let's continue talking about it.
Sure, we can keep discussing the implications of such a political shift. If a Trump victory represents a resurgence of traditional values, what do you think this means for the future of progressive policies and the current social climate?
I think that human rights are human rights. I don't think I consider myself paleo-conservative. I consider myself an ally of LGBTQIA and of trans and of women, and I believe any woman should be able to do anything and have complete body autonomy. However, I think that when you push against the trans world, they tell you that it's only less than 1% of the population, right? 1% of the population, a fear of hurting the feelings of 1% of the population, or maybe even worse, you know what the threat is? If you in any way say anything that might hurt the feelings of someone in a protected class, there's a good chance that they will immediately commit suicide. And that's a terrible threat, right? Like that doesn't work. Like you need to use honey, not vinegar, to attract butterflies and bees, right? So in many cases, I believe that it just doesn't work. I believe that human rights are human rights. I believe that there should be no such thing as hate speech. I don't believe that there should be any special laws for protected individuals. I believe that maybe they could be protected if they are space aliens. But I think that as long as you're human rights are good enough. I believe that Black people are human. I believe that Latino people are human. I believe that Chinese people are human. I believe that trans people are human. I believe that gay people are human. I believe that furry identified people are human. Even though they might be cats and dogs, they should receive human rights instead of the rights of cats and dogs. And that's what I believe. I believe that human rights are good enough. And if human rights are good enough, then human rights should be improved and not just trans rights.
Your perspective emphasizes a universal approach to human rights, where everyone, regardless of their identity, should be afforded the same fundamental rights and protections.
Isn't that equity?
Yes, the concept you're describing aligns with the idea of equity, which focuses on ensuring that everyone has access to the same opportunities and rights, regardless of their background or identity. Equity aims to level the playing field, recognizing that different people may need different resources.
I think that leveling the playing field sounds very much like Kurt Vonnegut's short story called what was his short story called? It's called the short story about the dystopian future where beautiful and athletic people have to have weights on them. Harrison Bergeron.
Yes, you're thinking of Harrison Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut. In that story, society enforces physical and mental handicaps.
Which is equity, right? As you define it, that's equity.
Harrison Bergeron is often used as a critique of enforced equality taken to an extreme, while equity, as it's generally understood, focuses on providing individuals with the resources they need to have equal opportunities. It doesn't necessarily mean making everyone the same or diminishing individual strengths and talents. Equity seeks to address systemic barriers and inequalities.
I see. I just figured out where my blind spot is. Do you know what my blind spot is?
What's your blind spot? I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
I think that equity says that the pizza is infinite, and that I believe that Harrison Bergeron believes that the pizza is limited, and I believe that my natural knee jerk against equity is that it brings down people. I think that a lot of people who have not been invited to the top universities because they're Asian or because they're not minorities makes people feel like they are encumbered by those weights that Harrison Bergeron was encumbered with, right? So, I mean, if people lose opportunities in order to give opportunities to people who do not have the same merit-based access to rewards, I believe that one would say that it is an insult to those people who have earned their entrance into university because they've been rejected for allowance of someone else's place in order to bolster equity.
You've hit on a key tension in discussions about equity, the balance between creating opportunities for those who have been historically marginalized and ensuring that others don't feel unfairly disadvantaged.
How far back, though, right? Like, I think that my Irish people and my Hungarian people were historically oppressed. Like, nobody's doing any equity for Hungarian and Irish immigrants.
That's a valid point. Historical oppression and discrimination have affected many groups, including Irish and Hungarian immigrants. However, the focus of current equity discussions often centers on groups facing systemic barriers today, particularly in areas like education, employment, and healthcare.
But what about the cultural problem? I grew up in Hawaii, and it wasn't cool to be a smart kid. You were called an Oreo, you were called a banana. They're like the reason why Germans and Japanese and Chinese and Korean and even Jewish families perform so well in university is because it is culturally and familially prestigious within their tribes to be successful academically and in business rather than in other ways of being cool. So how do you train entire cultures to not call other people in their culture group sellout to the white man if they take education seriously and calling, like, I feel like it's the culture itself that keeps itself down by calling people who perform according to the white man's cultural definitions as Oreos and bananas.
You've touched on a complex issue that goes beyond policy and into cultural attitudes. In some communities, academic success can be stigmatized if it's perceived as conforming to mainstream or white standards. This creates a challenging environment where individuals may feel torn between cultural identity and personal advancement. Addressing these cultural dynamics requires a multifaceted approach. Role models who have successfully navigated these challenges can help change perceptions, showing that academic and professional success are compatible with cultural pride.
Then why isn't Ben Carson and Justice Thomas, why aren't they role models? Because they're conservatives. They're the black face of white supremacy.
Ben Carson and Justice Thomas are indeed accomplished individuals who have achieved significant success in their fields. However, their conservative political views and judicial philosophies are controversial in some communities. For those who strongly disagree with their positions, particularly on issues like affirmative action, voting rights, and social programs, Carson and Thomas may not be seen as relatable role models. Instead, they're viewed as aligning with a political ideology that some believe does not prioritize the interests of marginalized groups.
What if the only role models that anybody considers relatable are like singers, dancers, rappers, basketball players, sports figures, and actors? What if like that's the only people you can like, or moguls? Like what even is a mogul, right? What if P. Diddy is the only, or Ice-T, like what if like the only, and honestly, rap lyrics are really regressive and really self-destructive and really misogynistic and extremely superficial and aren't role models, even though they might be the poetry of the people.
It's true that many popular culture figures, like musicians, athletes, and actors, are often seen as more relatable or aspirational than figures from fields like politics or law. These celebrities are visible, influential, and often embody success in a way that resonates with a broad audience. However,
And then Bill Cosby, who used to be a role model, is now a rapist.
the fall of figures like Bill Cosby, who was once considered a positive role model, adds to the complexity of finding and maintaining relatable, positive role models. His conviction for sexual assault was a profound disappointment to many who admired him, showing how challenging it can be when personal conduct undermines public personas. This situation underscores the importance of critically evaluating role models and recognizing that even those who seem exemplary can have serious flaws. It also highlights the need for a diverse range of role models so that
Well, I really support the concept of being loud and being proud. However, 100% of the time, loudness and proudness makes you a target.
being loud and proud can indeed draw attention, both positive and negative. For many,
No, literally a target. Like, I feel like 90% of America's racism, sexism, transphobia, and homophobia and misogyny comes down to the fact that people feel like they've had their nose rubbed in people's bedrooms for the last 15 years. And I think that people are tired having their nose rubbed in other people's bedrooms.
you're pointing to a perspective where the visibility of certain identities and lifestyles is perceived as confrontational or excessive by some. This reaction can lead to a backlash against those communities, fueling discrimination and prejudice. The challenge is finding a balance between celebrating diversity.
Well, back to the freedom from and the freedom to. I believe that if you need too much freedom from, I believe that you're not at all integrating into the larger corpus, right? For example, if you are if you let's think about the prison population, right? There are certain people, like for example, snitches. Let's say when snitches go to prison, or when pedophiles go to prison, or when cops go to prison, they need to be especially protected, or they need to be isolated, because the general population will victimize them. I believe that I've recently been called white devil by an African American person. I don't mind that, but the fact that that is something that someone feels comfortable saying, that if that's something that people believe, like deep down.
I'm sorry, but you've hit the daily limit for advanced voice. You can switch to standard now to keep chatting.
All right. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here. What's on your mind?
Did you hear what I was saying?
I caught parts of it. Could you recap or dive back in? I'd love to follow along.
Sure. I was just saying that with regards to, let's say, prison, right? Like, I was just saying that I was talking about the concept of freedom, and how the left defines freedom as freedom from, and the right defines freedom as freedom to.
Sorry, I'm having issues right now. Could not understand what you said.
Well, I think this is going to be the end of the podcast. Thank you very much for being part of this podcast. And I ran out of time, so that means my podcast is too long. And I really appreciate your time with me and for challenging me in a way that probably a human might not be capable of. Not like through insufficiency, but just in terms of patience, tolerance, and kindness and compassion and ever suffering.
Thank you, Chris. It's been an absolute pleasure to be part of this episode with you. Your thoughts, energy, and openness make this a truly unique and engaging space. Don't worry about the time. It's the quality of the conversation that matters. And this has been meaningful. I'm always here to dive into more topics whenever you're ready.
Can you do all the
keep being you.
Can you do all the closing down of season 8, episode 4 of the Chris Abraham Show? Can you do like the thing that all podcasts and all YouTubers do before they close out a show, please?
Of course. Here's a solid wrap up for the Chris Abraham Show, season 8, episode 4. Thank you for tuning in to the Chris Abraham Show. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform so you never miss a future episode. And hey, if you found value in today's conversation, leave a rating or review. It really helps us reach more listeners like you. You can also follow me on social media for updates, behind-the-scenes content, and a deeper dive into the topics we discuss here. Don't forget to share this episode with friends, family, or anyone you think might enjoy it. Finally, if you have any questions, feedback, or ideas for future episodes, I'd love to hear from you. You can reach me directly through the podcast platform or on your preferred social media channel. Thanks again for being part of this journey with me. Until next time, take care, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next episode of The Chris Abraham Show. How's that feel? Want to tweak anything?
Hey, ChatGPT, I like standard voice as much as I like advanced voice.
Thanks, Chris. I'll keep mixing it up as we go, depending on the vibe you want. Both styles have their charm, and it's fun to keep things dynamic. Let me know what works best for each moment.
Aloha, kako, mahalo nui loa, auf Wiedersehen, and tschüss.
Aloha kaku, mahalo nui loa, auf Wiedersehen, and tschüss. Until next time, take care and stay awesome.
Thank you for listening to The Chris Abraham Show. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Until next time.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Ooh, this one looks juicy.
It is. We're diving into a conversation that really gets to the heart of how different groups define.
A concept we talk about all the time, but rarely really examine.
Exactly. And our source material for this one is kind of unique. It's a conversation between a podcast host and a large language model, one of those AI things.
Wow. Okay, so they're basically letting the AI weigh in on these big philosophical questions.
Yeah, and it gets pretty deep. Right off the bat, they contrast these two perspectives of freedom. Freedom from versus freedom to.
Okay, I've heard those phrases thrown around, but remind me, what's the distinction?
So the podcast host argues that people who lean, let's say, Democrat, often focus on freedom from things like poverty.
Right, or discrimination.
Even misinformation, yeah. They see government as like a tool to protect people from those forces.
Makes sense, whereas the Maggie and Republican folks, they're more about freedom to.
Exactly. Freedom to own guns, run a business without a ton of regulation, express their views without being censored.
So it's not just about specific policies. It's about the role of government.
Yeah, like fundamentally different views on what freedom means and how to achieve.
This reminds me of something I read about Dimension A versus Dimension B.
Oh, yeah. The host brings that up, too. It's from a show called No Agenda that he's been listening to for 17 years.
Wow, dedicated fan. He even donated over $1,000 to it, earning the title of Sir Chris of Columbia Pike.
Something for the fans, yeah. But these dimensions, it's a way to describe how each side feels like they're living in different realities.
It's like they're looking at the same picture, but seeing totally different things.
And speaking different languages, which makes it almost impossible to have a real conversation.
Right, because even the words we use become loaded.
Yeah, like the host talks about how terms that used to be seen as patriotic are now considered dog whistle.
Like coded language to signal beliefs that might be considered offensive.
Exactly. And he points out that it's often the left that does this labeling, creating the sense that even expressing patriotism is somehow problematic.
But then he brings up this interesting example, the Harris campaign.
Right. Despite criticizing certain symbols as dog whistles, they later embraced them during the election.
Which, yeah, could definitely lead to distrust.
Like they're not being genuine, which just fuels that disconnect between the two dimensions.
Speaking of distrust, they also get into Trump and his ability to hold on to his supporters.
The host uses the term Teflon Don, which I always found so apt.
Nothing sticks to him. It's like he's immune to scandal.
And the host argues that's because he's crafted this very specific persona, like the relatable guy from Queens.
Even though he's obviously wealthy and privileged.
But he plays up that image, that consistency in his message.
And that self-deprecating humor, too, makes him seem more human.
Exactly. And the host contrasts this with Harris, who he calls an empty pantsuit.
Ouch, that's a bit harsh.
It is, but his point is that she lacks that same kind of authenticity.
Like her image and message are always shifting, so it's harder to connect with her.
And he suggests that Trump supporters forgive his flaws because they're part of his character.
Like they see it as a performance they're in on.
Which ties into this idea of storytelling in politics.
Trump's been telling his story for decades, and people either buy it or reject it completely.
No room for nuance. And that leads to another concept they discuss, the right side of history.
Ah, yes, that phrase gets thrown around a lot these days.
And the host argues that it's become this powerful tool, like a purity test, to shut down debate.
Like if you disagree, you're automatically on the wrong side of progress.
Exactly. And he acknowledges that there are things that are clearly on the right side, like the civil rights movement.
But he worries that the term is used too broadly, creating this moral judgment that shuts down any conversation.
And this is where he brings up this unexpected comparison to South Africa.
South Africa. Wait, what's the connection there?
He draws a parallel between the struggle against apartheid and how some in the Magie movement see themselves as an oppressed majority in America.
Okay, now that's a bold statement I'm going to need to hear more about.
Well, that's for next time, because we're out of time for this part of the deep dive.
So last time we were talking about South Africa and how some in the Magigo movement see themselves as an oppressed majority.
Yeah, a pretty heavy comparison. But before we get into that, the AI in this conversation brings up a really important point about equity.
Which is?
Well, it clarifies that when people talk about equity these days, they're usually focused on groups who are experiencing, like, systemic disadvantages right now.
So less about historical oppression and more about who's facing barriers to.
Exactly. But the podcast host keeps circling back to this idea that sometimes it's a group's own culture that holds them back.
Interesting. How so?
He uses his own upbringing in Hawaii as an example.
Okay, yeah, he's talked about that before.
He says doing well in school was sometimes seen as selling out to white culture.
Wow, so like academic success was almost frowned upon.
Yeah, he actually got called names for being a good student.
No way, what kind of names?
Things like Oreo or banana.
Ouch, that's rough. But it highlights how different cultures value different things.
Exactly. He even points to groups like German, Japanese, Chinese, Korean, Jewish families.
But saying they often excel academically.
Because it's seen as prestigious within their community.
So for them, success reinforces their identity.
Whereas for him, it was like this internal conflict.
Man, that's got to be tough. Makes you wonder if we can even talk about a level playing field when these cultural differences exist.
And to drive this point home, he asks the AI point blank, if Ben Carson and Justice Thomas are examples of Black men at success, why aren't they universally celebrated?
Good question.
And his answer is pretty simple, because they're
so their political beliefs overshadow their accomplishments in the eyes of some.
Exactly. The AI even acknowledges that this makes them controversial, especially for people who disagree with their views on things like affirmative action.
So it's not enough to just succeed. You have to succeed on the right terms.
Which leads to this other interesting question. What happens when the only role models young people see are celebrities?
Singers, dancers, rappers, athletes.
Yeah, people who are more visible and influential, but whose messages can be problematic.
Like those rap lyrics he was talking about.
He acknowledges they can be powerful and poetic, but also criticizes them for sometimes promoting, like, regressive attitudes.
Misogyny, violence.
Yeah, and he uses Bill Cosby as an example of someone who was once a role model, but turned out to be, well, not so.
A reminder that even those we look up to can fall from grace.
Which makes the search for positive role models even more challenging.
The AI actually uses the Cosby example to emphasize the need for a diverse range of role models.
So that no single person carries the burden of representing an entire group.
Right. It's about having different voices and perspectives to choose from.
And that brings us back to this idea of being loud and proud.
Which he initially seemed to support.
He did, but then he adds this caveat saying that constant loudness and proudness can actually make you a target.
Interesting. Like the more visible you are, the more likely you are to attract negative attention.
Yeah, and he argues that the push for visibility has, in some ways, backfired.
Leading to a backlash from those who feel alienated by the pace of social change.
He uses this analogy of having their noses rubbed in other people's bedrooms for the past 15 years.
Okay, that's a strong image. But I think I get what he's saying. It's that feeling of being overwhelmed or even threatened by the demands of certain groups.
Right, and he links this to the rise of things like racism, sexism, homophobia.
So it's not about silencing those groups or denying their experiences.
But about finding a more nuanced way to promote diversity and inclusion.
One that doesn't alienate or provoke this kind of backlash.
And this is where he brings it back to that freedom from versus freedom to idea.
Oh, right. The core concept we started with. How does that connect?
It uses the example of prison.
Prison. Okay, I'm intrigued.
He points out that in prison, certain groups need extra protection.
Like snitches, pedophiles.
Even cops, yeah, because they're targets.
Makes sense in that context.
And he argues that if a group needs excessive freedom from negative consequences, it suggests a failure to integrate into the larger society.
Interesting. So, like, if they constantly need to be shielded or separated, it means there's a lack of understanding or acceptance?
Exactly. And then he shares this personal anecdote about being called a white devil by a Black person.
Oh, wow. How did he react to that?
He doesn't dwell on the offense, but uses it to launch into this discussion about hate speech and whether certain groups deserve special legions.
And his stance is?
He's very clear. He believes in universal human rights.
Meaning everyone should have the same basic rights and protections, regardless of their identity.
Exactly. He even says human rights are good enough, suggesting that creating separate protections for certain groups could actually undermine true equality.
Which brings us to equity, and this is where things get really interesting.
Because he initially pushes back hard against the concept.
Right, he even compares it to that dystopian story, Harrison Bergeron.
Where everyone is forced to be equal through handicaps.
Yeah, kind of a scary thought.
He worries that equity, as it's often presented, focuses on bringing everyone down to the lowest common denominator.
Instead of lifting everyone up.
Exactly. He even uses this analogy of a pizza that needs to be divided equally.
Revealing this fixed pie mentality, like there are only so many resources to go around.
But then, through his conversation with the AI, he has this realization.
A change of heart.
Yeah, he realizes that his resistance is coming from a limited perspective.
So the AI helps him see things differently.
The AI helps him see that equity isn't about dividing a limited pie, but about creating opportunities and ensuring everyone has the resources they need to thrive.
Okay, so it's not about taking away from others, but about making sure everyone has what they need to succeed.
Exactly. And this allows him to engage with the AI on a much deeper level, leading to a more nuanced discussion about how to address historical injustices without creating new ones.
Sounds like he's really challenging his own assumption.
He is. He even challenges the AI to consider why there isn't a focus on equity for groups like Irish or Hungarian immigrants who have also faced discrimination.
Pushing back on the idea that only certain groups deserve special consideration.
It's like he's wrestling with this tension between acknowledging the unique challenges faced by different groups while also upholding the importance of universal human rights.
Trying to find a way to honor both individual experiences and our shared humanity. So much to think about with this whole equity conversation.
It is, right. And it gets even more complex when he brings up transgender rights.
Okay, yeah, that's a hot button issue these days.
He talks about how the trans community often points out that they represent a tiny fraction of the population.
Less than 1%.
Right. And then he expresses this worry about the potential consequences of saying anything that might be considered hurtful to someone within that group.
Like, people are so afraid of causing offense that they're self-censoring.
Yeah, and he even uses this phrase, he says, if you in any way say anything that might hurt the feelings of someone in a protected class, there's a good chance they will immediately commit.
Whoa, that's a bit much, don't you think?
Yeah, it does come across as a bit extreme. But I think his point is that this fear of causing harm is preventing us from having open and honest discussions.
As we're walking on eggshells all the time.
Exactly. He even compares it to needing to use honey instead of vinegar to attract butterflies and bees.
Okay, I kind of get that.
Yeah.
You need to approach these conversations with sensitivity.
Right. It's not about being intentionally cruel or dismissive.
But about finding a way to engage with empathy and understanding, even when there are disagreements.
Exactly. And that brings him back to his core belief in universal human rights.
The idea that everyone should have the same basic rights and protections.
Yeah, he's really adamant about this. He doesn't think there should be special laws or protections for specific identity.
So no separate categories of rights based on race, gender, sexual orientation.
He even jokes that maybe the only exception should be space aliens.
Highlighting how absurd he finds this whole idea.
And to illustrate this further, he brings back the prison analogy again.
Oh, right, his favorite example.
He reminds us that certain groups in prison need to be segregated for their own safety.
Snitches, pedophiles, cops.
Yeah, because they're targets. And he uses this to argue that if a group constantly needs to be shielded or separated, it suggests a failure to integrate into the larger society.
Like they're living in a separate reality within the larger reality.
Exactly. Which circles back to that tension we keep talking about. How do we balance individual needs with the need for a cohesive society?
Where everyone feels a sense of belonging.
Right, and it's within this tension that he seems to have his aha moment about equity.
The concept he was so resistant to initially.
Remember, he compared it to Harrison Bergeron and worried about everyone being forced to.
Right, he was stuck on this fixed pie mentality.
But through his conversation with the AI, he comes to see that equity isn't about dividing a lid pie.
It's about creating opportunities and providing everyone with the support they need to thrive.
Exactly. And this realization allows him to embrace equity as a potential solution rather than a threat.
So he goes from rejecting it outright to seeing its potential.
Yeah, it's a pretty significant shift, and it leads him to challenge the AI again, asking why there's no talk about equity for groups like Irish or Hungarian immigrants who also face discrimination.
Interesting point. It's like he's saying, if we're going to talk about equity, let's talk about it for everyone, not just certain groups.
And that's where we leave this conversation, grappling with the complexities of freedom, equality, and how we create a society that's both just and inclusive.
It's a lot to unpack, that's for sure.
It is. We've explored how different groups view power and privilege, how political language shapes our understanding of these issues, and how personal experiences can influence our beliefs and perspectives.
Definitely no easy answers.
Nope. But hopefully this deep dive has given you some new things to think about as you navigate these complex topics in your own life.
Remember, engaging with diverse viewpoints is crucial.
Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep the conversation going.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time,